In the last few years, I've also been looking at what has happened in terms of shifts in how firms have adopted, how business models have changed in response to how consumers have evolved. At the core of this, there are four changes that I see in the consumer world. There's one, the increased adoption of digital means of engagement. Consumers are very happy engaging digitally, both in terms of pre-purchase or engagement with the company during the purchase process, or even the after sales post-purchase process. There's a lot of acceptance to digital, if not enthusiastic adoption in the last few months, thanks to the lockdown and the pandemic. The second change that I'm seeing with very rapidly that's happening, especially in markets like India, is a lot of these rural internet penetration is being driven by mobile first. A lot of consumers are reaching on to the internet through the mobile phone first than the traditional, at least our generation came to the internet from desktop PCs, then came laptops and tablets, and now we are using smartphones. A lot of people start their internet journey with the mobile phones, and especially in tier 2, tier 3 and rural India, mobile is the only way of reaching the internet. A third thing that I'm seeing changing, and thanks to my research on platforms and all of that, is there's a reduced emphasis on asset ownership. A lot of people want to lease rather than buy. In fact, there is also a lot of discussions that are going around in some of my student communities where the people are even looking at renting things, not just cars, leasing cars, but they're also trying to even rent bridal gowns. I'm not going to wear this gown every time. I'm going to get married once, hopefully not more than this thing. So why buy a bridal gown? I would rather rent it and customize it for me. I mean, there are even, ownership is not something that was as celebrated as our generation was, where you settle down when you own certain things, right? The fourth thing that I'm talking about, thanks to this rental and all of those businesses, is also this emergence of gig economy. There are a lot of gig workers that are happening who are trying to provide uh, all of these services to consumers. But on the other side, if you look at actually the gig economy workers as consumers, these are people who are not exactly looking at stability of the job. They're not looking at a long-term career. I know of one person who is a very nice visual designer. He decided that he will get onto a gig economy for a month because he wanted to afford enough money to buy an iPhone 12. 1 month, did some design, got himself enough money to buy an iPhone 12. He's off the platform. Now, these are the kind of things that are happening in the world. In this kind of the world, I mean, I think these are the four markers I have in my head: digital, mobile first, leasing rather than owning, and a lot of these short-term employment contracts. We have a wonderful panel of three different businesses. We have a consumer business where people buy consumers impulse fashion. We have, in the same fashion business, a B2B business where somebody is actually looking at 3 months, 6 months down the line, what will the consumers be, and therefore be able to buy for them and therefore be able to produce for them. And then we have the rental leasing business, the entire idea of consumer, but a durable business. I don't want to invest, but I want to be enjoying the car kind of a business. So we have this entire nice stratified sample of people, if I may use a traditional business school word. So let me first bring in Manisha to talk about what is this whole thing about leasing. Are people continuing to believe in leasing, short-term ownership, or do people just settle down buying a house and a car and get married? Is that passe today?
Thanks, Prof. Uh, well, we are actually seeing two different trends emerging right now. So you're right to say leasing is definitely coming up, and we are seeing people also want to look at uh, pay as you use models are coming up very rapidly. So I'll give you an example, right? So we launched what we call like a Netflix for cars last year, sometime in March, where you can subscribe to a car and you can change it every month. Initially, now every 3 months, if you want, as your needs change. and you don't need to sign a contract. You pay through your credit card. You browse it online. You come and pick up the car whenever you want to. So there was no agility in the model. So that business currently has more demand than we can actually supply cars. So you're right that people are doing that simply because it's heavy on the pocket. The whole financing is quite heavy. People are not sure about their jobs. But there's another sort of innovation that we are seeing coming up, which is the cost that comes with the ownership of a car. So, for example, insurance. The way insurance has been bought still is very traditional, right? Whenever your premiums are due, you go online, you get the best price that you can find. Maybe throw in a promo code, and then you purchase, but you pay for the entire year ahead. So you pay in advance. Now, what we are seeing now, and what we launched in Singapore, and we were the first to do it, is we launched what we call usage-based insurance, which means all the devices, be it rental or even cars that are purchased from us, come with a pre-installed telematics device that will only charge customers based on how much they drive towards the end of the month. Okay. So essentially, because of COVID, a lot of people are either not driving as much, or actually people are driving more because they would rather not take shared mobility. And the same car is now serving as a school bus for kids. So there are actually two different, I would say, trends that are emerging. One is the leasing or subscribing to a car, and the other one is ownership, but people are more conscious of the pocket and the quantum that they're spending on a used car, but they want to control their ownership cost with technology and with digitization as much as possible. So this is something that we're seeing in the automotive space.
Wonderful. I'll pick on the same thread to Rashmi. How do consumers make decisions on fashion today? Earlier, fashion was about seeing someone, imitating someone, go, try, right? Now, there's no trial room today. With all of these epidemics, it's very difficult to try out fashion.
Yeah, not just trying out, but the entire premise has changed. So, for example, the business that I head, which is jaipur.com, we are a part of Bridge to Luxury, which brings the most sustainable artisanal clothing and lifestyle home products to consumer. But suddenly come COVID, you were confined to homes. We were doing a lot of special occasion clothing, which requires you to go out and socialize and meet people and dress up. And here you were at home, and the requirement was partially to dress down. So I guess the first month was a little tough on consumer and businesses alike. But because one, we were a .com, and we, apart from the fact that we had to shut down our retail stores basis the government regulations, but the digital shop does not closes, and fortunately that stays on 24/7. So after the first month where the consumer rediscovered their essentials and they settled down in the rhythm of lockdown, we figured that there are new needs of clothing. In our entire portfolio at ABG, which is largely menswear work formals of Alan Solly, Van Heusen, Louis Philippe, we reintroduced athleisure and a lot of comfortable clothing in our women's wear portfolio. And we saw demand from everywhere, from men and women alike, who were saying that now we are working from home and working for home. So you had to switch between, attending a webinar and a Zoom meeting and an office meeting to suddenly helping your child with their education and working in the kitchen. And you can't be switching your clothes between. So there was a requirement of comfortable clothing and not as much requirement of rich fabrics like silk and chanderi. So we re-switched and pivoted very, very fast to natural fabrics that are more comfortable, fabrics that are more, in an office environment, you are dressed sharp, you are in an air-conditioned environment. Our homes are designed differently. The homes are not designed like offices. So we re-pivoted quickly to make our clothing lines more suitable to work from home and work for home. And I think Q1 was all around that, but we saw the result of it all coming back in Q2. And we can talk about that in a little detail later. But I think fashion has also seen a reshift of how people are looking at their clothing and their wardrobe.
So let me bring in Shiva here. Should I call you Shiva?
Yeah, Shiva will be good.
Perfect. Shiva, how is this globally? What are your consumers, your customers talking about global demand? India, we know that kitchens are not air conditioned, bedrooms may be air conditioned, workrooms may be air conditioned. And Rashmi has an interesting this thing of moving in and out of air conditioning and non-air conditioning places.
Right.
What about your customers?
So we supply to fashion retailers. So we supply to the likes like Gap, Banana Republic, H&M, Zara, and so on and so forth, as well as consumers like customers like Columbia, who are in outerwear manufacturing. So in that sense, we have our customer base, which clothes bulk of the world and catering to over 50 countries. And when I look at the pandemic hit world. Initially, I found that most of the stores were locked, people were not buying clothes, etc. So there was that phenomenon which was widely prevalent, and we found that most of the brands pivoted very strongly into e-commerce. So e-marketplaces are growing at a meteoric pace. I also find discounters as a format are running up market share and continuing, their steady rise across the globe. Mall and department stores were footfall challenged, but retailers are providing omni-channel experience, so you can buy online and pick up in the store model. So those kind of models are encouraging customers to get back. Now when I look at the US market, so in the months of April, the sales were down some 80% compared to April of the previous year, April 20 versus April 19. But when it came to September, the sales are just down about 13%. So by and large, the market seems to be coming back, but having pivoted a little more towards e-commerce driven market, and demand is coming from that direction. Now, with this, I'm also seeing that consumers are also somewhat becoming brand promiscuous. So they're not, brand loyal as they used to be. So they are open to trying out other brands, especially when they are on e-commerce marketplaces. So these trends are also throwing up new winners in the retail game. So from a manufacturer perspective, we tend to see, how best we can diversify our customer space, that thereby we somehow remain closer to the end consumer and have an agile supply chain. That way we are good to go as far as the supplying to the world is concerned, regardless of which retailer comes out on top. The retail market also has got two kinds of suppliers. One is the pure fashion brands, like H&M, as I said, but there are also grocers like Target and Walmart, which remained open through the pandemic. People have to go there to buy their goods, and they found their sales catching up as well. So it's an interesting trend where a lot, on in-store sales are somewhat moving to even the grocers, and online is growing very rapidly.
Well, that's very interesting to be able to sell apparel in a grocery store.
That's right, because these are stores which sell a plethora of products, including grocery items and apparel and jewelry and so on and so forth. And people in these times are buying more of casual wear, the formal wear. For instance, suits as a market has dropped by 85%, but
Right.
casual wear has dropped only by 10-15% year on year, which means, or in some cases, almost back to normal. So when you buy those kind of goods, you're open to buying anywhere, I suppose.
That's right. I think it makes a interesting shift.
Mhm.
And what I hear from all three of you is that the companies have listened to the audience, listened to the customers. So what are your digital ways of listening? I will reverse the cycle now, because Manisha did talk about a telematic device which listened to how much the customer is driving. Is she driving more? Is she driving less? Is she driving kids? Is she driving to work? What is your telematic device? How do you, Shiva, figure out this customer is changing, or this market is moving this way, or this market is moving? What are your eyes and ears of the consumer market?
Interesting. So we have to keep eyes and ears on two things. One is end consumer, which is you and I going to the shop, what are we buying, etc. And one is which brand is doing well, except because our customers are the brands, right? So I have to pick the winners and then start working with them. So when it comes to tracking the end consumer, we are looking, we have access to the brand's own websites which are selling, and then we see that, which products are selling better, which products are not selling as well, and so on and so forth. So we get a lot of statistical analysis. Yeah, and we continuously monitor the e-trade business. So what kind of garments are selling, what price points are more prevalent, and so on and so forth. Apart from fashion trends that we always monitor, this throws us insights into products that have currency that are getting sold, so on and so forth, and continuously monitoring our brands, which are the large customers of ours, looking at their financials, their ability to survive and prosper going forward, their increase in sales, because many of them have pivoted to omnichannel. So some of them have been very successful at that, and some of them have grown their business. Some of them are still seeing tepid response from their customers. So then identifying who among them are growing better, and then start aligning ourselves to those brands and to those products in specifically. The business also is very fashion driven. So what sells in spring and summer is not what sells in autumn, winter. So the products are different, and thus one has to also, from a manufacturer perspective, make sure that we produce all kinds of garments which work in all weather, and have to track very closely that this autumn what is selling and what is not selling. Products are more expensive because these are jackets, etc. And when it comes to spring and summer, what sells. For example, what we produce in Q3, we're currently in the third quarter of our financial year, is what will get consumed in spring 2021. Now, spring 2021 has a legacy of spring 2020, because in spring 2020, most of the stores were shut in the Western markets. And most of the brands are carrying a ton of inventory, which got stuck in their warehouses. Right. Now, how do we deal with the inventory wall ahead of us between us as a manufacturer and the end consumer, which is all the inventory lying in the stores? So how do we now still address that market and still get our factories full? Remember, as a manufacturer, we carry a fixed cost of our capacities. Now, if the capacity drops beyond a threshold, then we will carry a huge loss. So we will need to find demand for ourselves, and that's the challenge.
So you have a double testing of the bullwhip that's happening because of the inventory pileup.
Right.
You will also have this entire idea of predicting what will sell in July.
That's correct.
Wonderful. How does Rashmi, Aditya Birla Fashion, do this prediction? You're still on mute, Rashmi.
We've all spoken about how the e-commerce part of the business has multifolded, and how McKinsey says that we've covered decades in days. Some reports say that we've kind of covered 6 years worth of ground in 6 months. And when you're talking about consumer hearing, the e-commerce and the digital part allows you to actually, there is an internal and external part. Of course, we hear all the social chatter that's happening on Facebook and our Instagram. But the data allows you, when you are only retail, you're kind of dependent on your store manager to be your eyes and ears and be able to tell you that why did a particular product did not sell, let's say in Bareilly. But in the digital world, you are able to track in which consumer from Bareilly at what hour logged into from the Android device and spend how much time on which category on your website. And that's powerful data. So we kind of, studied that deeply as to how the consumer shift was, changing while the lockdown is in progress. And we saw, like I spoke, we saw a shift from special occasion wearing to people clicking so much more on loungewear, and we increased our, width and variety across that segment. Two, as lockdown kind of, entered into a longer period and people kind of settled, we saw some very, very interesting trends coming in. Apart from apparel, people were settled into home, and it's the first time, the humankind has been confined to their dwellings for such long confined period, and people started looking at their homes differently. And we saw a shift in the consumption of home goods at our website. We also host home goods and art and home textile, home linen. And suddenly something that was about 2 to 3% of our business started increasing share multifold to now it's almost in the 8th month, it's about 10x of what that business was at the beginning of the lockdown. And because we were hearing all that data, because we were seeing the shift, we started seeing how art started selling suddenly. So within the lockdown, because we also have a marketplace, we could, with ferocious speed, onboard 300 new vendors in the category and almost enable a new segment, a new category of the business. And that's what the digital world allows, because if you're listening and if you're agile, then the speed of creating new categories and businesses can be phenomenal. What otherwise can take a couple of years sometimes to create can happen in a matter of weeks and months.
So I want to come back to you. You figured out that there is a huge demand for things like wallet or
People were using more bed sheets suddenly, because the usage was higher. You were washing it more often, etc. Suddenly, bed sheets were seeing 10x sale versus the kurtas, which were down. So you needed more bed sheets in your portfolio.
And what's happening to the supply chains? Did you have enough bedsheet producers who can scale up as quickly as?
Honestly, initially it was challenging because there was no playbook to it. You had craftsmen, the immigrants were leaving their main cities and going back home. The factories were shut down. So there was disruption. But because you could reach out to many more people together faster, you could build up a network which could supply to the rising demand.
Wonderful.
Also, what happens, opening up a store can take time, but digitally onboarding can be far faster.
But it sounds so easy to me. It sounds so easy that I can onboard a vendor faster, but you need to be able to go through a lot.
There is complexity behind it. And like we said, that loads and loads of factories and supply chain systems were shut. So even when there was demand and people wanted to supply, we were facing challenges. But I think as days passed, the network figured out a rhythm as to how to, and we even had situations where we wanted to, there were artisans in the rural background, grassroots level, who had their global orders cancelled.
Right.
And then somebody reached out to Jaipur.com saying, you are an artisan platform and are you willing to help us? Now, in normal circumstances, people can, we can travel to that place, we can shoot their goods, etc. But now we couldn't even travel. So technology comes to your rescue where you were able to teach and train that artisan in rural Kutch, Gujarat, to shoot their wares on a mobile phone and then upload that from that link, to head offices in Delhi and Bangalore and take their goods to the whole country. So we've seen some major shifts. We've been pushed to relook at how we work, and I think the adoption has been far faster.
So we've traded the quality of the bedsheet to the quality of the photograph. Wonderful. Manisha, how do you listen to your customers?
So for us, right, it was very different from what Rashmi and Shiva shared. So for us, our customers, the demand was actually penting up during the lockdown because suddenly people can't travel anywhere. They would rather have a car, a reliable car, that at least they can travel a little bit, at least do grocery shopping or whatever essential they need, right? So we had a huge pent-up demand. Our challenge was that because of the lockdown, all the showrooms were shut. All the test drives were not allowed. So suddenly the traditional way of selling cars had come to a standstill. So what that gave us was a huge opportunity. And what we did is we actually broke the entire customer experience and we rewrote it. If we had to ask our customers, I think by that time war would be over. So what we did is this, we actually rejig our entire website and we put up all of our inventory of cars and also of our partners online. We took much better photos of the cars. We standardized the photos as well. We started providing 150 inspection point report, which means it's like a health report of a car, right? Available for each and every car that was put up online. For as far as the journey is concerned, it was made end-to-end totally digital. So you go online, car.sg, you browse the cars, you make an appointment to view a car. And once the sales rep has made an appointment, you go down to view the car and you would get an OTP into your smartphone and there's a digital lock near the car. You key in that OTP and then you get the keys of the car. The car and you can actually turn on the car. And for certain customers who were our existing customers, we even gave them the technology to do a smartphone lock unlock. So they didn't even need a key to actually unlock the car because we've already done the due diligence on them. So yeah, so you can still go to the car. So what we created was like a hybrid customer experience where there was no human contact at all from end to end. So you go to the car, you unlock the car, you turn it on, you smell the leather, you kick the tires, see if the air conditioning is working, and you could do a virtual call any time of the day, 24/7 with any of the sales representatives who will take you through the car virtually. Now, if as a customer, if your credit history is good, you can technically do all of your paperwork beforehand. So again, this was done to rejig the customer experience. So you have an already approved financing done. Your insurance is already done and settled. And you do a smartphone remote lock unlock. You on the car, you like it, and we give you a 3-day test drive. So again, we change the customer experience to provide what the customers needed to have that confidence in buying a car end to end without really meeting a human being physically. So we give them a 3-day test drive. And if they did not like the car, you can come and return it and you can take something else. No questions asked. So that's how we changed the customer experience, and we made it digital end to end with enough, I would say, hybrid of physical interaction with the car, because car is a very heavy commitment and it's also an emotional purchase. Right? So we don't want to take that away from the customers. So we did that. And I know earlier Shiva was talking a little bit about the distribution channels, right? So what we did is in Indonesia, we actually partnered with Tokopedia, which is a huge, the number one e-commerce player. And customers, apart from wanting to test drive at home, because in Indonesia, people wanted the car to be driven to them. They don't want to do the whole thing digitally, which is fine. They could do a deposit using Tokopedia app. So we changed that. And in Singapore, we had recently had a Singles Day. So 11/11, it's like a huge e-commerce day where a lot of shopping happens. So for the first time, we did a Facebook Live with just one of the influencers. We tried it for fun in Singapore, and we were selling cars, on Facebook Live for the first time online, and we got enough, interest, and lead generation happened. And today, our first car was sold from that Facebook Live event. So it's actually very heartening to see how people are actually opening up. If you empower the customer with enough information that makes the whole experience trustworthy, gives them peace of mind, digitize it, reduce the human contact. In fact, take it away altogether. The customers are actually happier, and they are coming with you on this journey to take one step forward. So it's actually very encouraging for us.
Call me old world, but I still want to smell the car before I make the choice.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
me, but I mean, car buying is such an emotional purchase, a very high involvement purchase. A lot of people, for them, the car is their identity and they're out in the street. How did you manage the significant others, the spouses, the mothers, the kids, the teens who influence the parents buying the car?
Well, so here's the thing, right? Because we were no longer confined to the brick and mortar of a showroom, it was a showroom anywhere. You can essentially view a car anywhere. So suddenly that barrier of, you have to make an appointment before you come to the showroom. It's only open certain days of the week, and 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. was totally gone. You could view a car 24/7. If you want to come down as a family, have a look at it. All you need is we'll bring the car over to you. Again, the same OTP. You get the keys on the engine. You kick the tires. As a family, you sit and see if it's nice or not. And again, there was a 3-day test drive. I mean, nobody has done a 3-day test drive for a used car here. We were the first crazy ones to do it. And we also gave a 30-day wear and tear guarantee on used car. Again, nobody is doing it in Singapore. So we were first to do it. So the bottom line is, instead of waiting for the customers to tell us, I think I may need this or I may need that, I think more tech companies like us, we have to pretty much set the way. At least we go out with something. If it doesn't work, we change it a little bit and then we go out again, rather than do social listening and wait. By the time war is over for us.
How did you get the supply right? How did you get a bunch of cars? You talk about all those tests, 150 tests and all that stuff.
Yeah.
That's labor intensive. That's
It
data
is.
intensive. That's labor intensive.
We have our own workshops. So we also own workshops.
Mm-hmm.
So our mechanics are the ones who would do the...
They would be there physically doing all of that.
No, so they've already done the work. Before the car is put up online, before you see it, the mechanic has already done the 115 inspection check of the car and has digitally uploaded it as part of the other details that go off on the car on the web page. So every car listing has, like I said, give the customer all the information possibly we can online, simplest way possible, so they feel confident. And as far as supply is concerned, right, Prof, what happened is, so we are in this business now for 5 years, and we have a huge B2B buying and selling of cars that happens, which you don't see. Obviously, the customers will not see it, right? That happens elsewhere. So all we need to do is that once we get a sense that, oh, these days there's more demand of, and it's a fact, there's more demand for value cars that are either mid-sized sedans or hatchbacks.
Right.
Because they are cheaper as well. So the quantum is the one that's determining. So all we need to do is, while this big B2B is happening, where we facilitate trade between used car dealerships, and we did it almost like, I think $1 billion US dollar worth of car trade happened in 2019 by Caro. So all we need to do is, we know where the demand is coming from. We just take it from there, we pluck it, we check it, we make sure that it makes a good grade, and then we put it online for sale. So it's really it's actually quite easy for us because the supply already exists.
I was just prodding you, like Rashmi enabled, Aditya Birla enabled the sellers to do their own videos, to do their own this thing. You didn't empower the sellers to make their own declarations?
So our cars can come from an existing customer, or they can also come from a used car dealer. So again, if I go back to B2B, right? We've actually developed SaaS models for used car dealerships, and we actually provide financing to them as well, including flow stock financing. We even credit score them based on their payment structure, etc. So we have a very vibrant network of used car dealers who are already working with us, in a way also relying on us for financing needs. All we have to do is tap onto that and then move the cars into the retail space. So it wasn't really as challenging as Rashmi, where we had to change the kurtas to the bed sheets. No, a car is a car. All we had to do is sense the kind of budget that customers have, the kind of cars that they want, and just take it from there and just move it here.
So get the SUV supply down and get the sedans. Right.
I think the expensive cars. So what we're seeing is, if you look at a BMW, like the 1 Series, 2 Series are still doing well, probably the 3 Series at max. But 5 and above, the market is really down. Similarly, for Toyotas, Hondas, the market is good. But again, if you go to your again, Mercedes, your A-class, B-class is okay. C is still okay, but S-class is totally down. Yeah. So, yeah.
So how do we maintain or sustain the quality? Go back to Shiva's factories. You had a lot of people moving across the country, people moving across, leaving large cities and going off to this one. How did we sustain operations in workshops and factories? How did we sustain quality?
Okay. So it's interesting, when lockdown was announced in the end of last week of March, all our factories had perforce to be shut. So most of the workers were staying at home. We continued to pay their salaries. Interestingly, we never relied on, labor force, which were migrant labor force. We were always, preferring labor force which were living in and around our factories. For the simple reason that, that brings a lot of stability in our operations. Like migrant labor force would always go on a long leave during Diwali or Chhat Puja and stuff like that. And that disrupts our operations. So this was a decision we had taken even earlier and got rid of migrant labor force much earlier. So to an extent, that stood us in good stead, that we were only banking on labor in and around our factories. Having said that, when the lockdown got announced, many of them went back to their native places. Like, factories in Bangalore, for instance, would attract labor from upcountry Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu. People went back to their hometowns, villages, etc., and the availability was low. So when the factories opened, like initially we were producing a lot of healthcare garments. We started producing PPEs for the government during the lockdown. And then subsequently, when the factories were allowed to be open for normal business, we started tapping back into our workforce. In many cases, we helped them come back to town by organizing buses and other facilities to get back. Initially, of course, we were operating at about 50%. We also, mind you, had to give social distancing in the factories. So the workstations, the machines were put at suitable distance away from one another. So capacity in the factories fell because of distancing norms. And then slowly, as we started rebuilding our people back, we helped them come back and resettle closer to our factories. It took a while. Like come September, we were at about 85% of the pre-COVID workforce working in our factories. We're still down about 10 or 15%, but our operations are to the fullest. So what happened? While we were in a lockdown, we started working a lot on our operations itself. Not incremental thinking, pretty significant, capacity improvement through productivity. So whatever we could digitize in the operations in terms of tracking, we did a lot of video analysis of operations to drive efficiency. In an assembly line, it's your bottleneck which determines the productivity of the assembly line. So how do I increase my throughput? In fact, we have increased our throughput considerably during this period of time. That we managed to get more out of fewer people. We also did a lot of engineering and a lot of automation in critical processes. So all of these, we were not keeping quiet during this process. We did a lot of manufacturing rejig during this period, which enabled us to step up our production regardless of the workforce challenges that we have. Even today, even while we are operating at about 85% of our pre-COVID workforce, we have a huge amount of absenteeism. So women who feel that they have a cough or a cold are encouraged to stay back, lest they feel uncomfortable and the others feel uncomfortable about them working with the others. So absenteeism, which used to be in low single digits, are now running at about 18%. Because any given point in time, somebody or the other is unwell or have a family member who's unwell. Now, how do you run an operations with this large number of absentees or large percentage of absenteeism? And we are a manpower intensive business, having 25,000 people working in our different factories. So that itself was a huge challenge from a planning perspective, saying who's not going to come today is at the start of the day is unknown. So how do we get advanced information? How do we plan our day accordingly? So there's a lot of protocols, a lot of planning that went in and changes that went in our factories, which allowed us to offset some of these practical challenges that we were encountering during this period.
In fact, if I replace the COVID pandemic with what you said so far, it looks like an agricultural operations. A typical agriculturalist will have a trade-off between automation and labor, and
that's right. But the only thing is that here you're like in a factory environment, you're producing it. So it's a year-round operations.
That's
and
right.
And there is a system and process to it. There is a quality standard to it. I mean, we produce to an AQL 1 quality, let's say. Now that's a very, very high tolerance level. So how do you? Agriculture has got a very different connotation in terms of quality and processes, etc. Right? Whereas in a export-driven manufacturing environment, your standards are bar is set very high. I'm sorry, say that again.
Agriculture is a 4-month batch process.
That is correct, and this is a year-round one. But keep in mind that in a apparel factory, for example, let's take cars for example, right? If I take a Toyota factory, that factory would be producing a kind of car. Let's say an Innova. From January to December, it will be producing Innovas. Same car. I can automate it. I can humans are just assisting machines to get the thing done, right? And I can drive productivity. I can even have just-in-time supply chain. When it comes to apparel, every 15-20 days, I'm changing the kind of garment I'm producing, right? The design of the garment is different. The nature is different. The fabric is different. I'm producing a viscose-based garment, and then I'm moving into a thick cotton-based garment. The feel of the garment itself is different. So and the raw materials are coming from different places. So certain garments will have raw materials coming from players in India. Many, certain components will come from China, Korea, Taiwan, etc. So supply chain becomes extremely critical as we are constantly changing what is on the assembly line, and we have 250 assembly lines. So there is the complexity levels are huge in terms of managing the supply chain, managing the product variety, and each garment also is produced in different sizes, mind you, and different colors, and so on and so forth. So the SKUs are huge, and that drives a whole lot of supply chain dynamics, which we need to be on top of if we have to produce it on time, in full, and to quality of the customers. So if I have an order for, say, 50,000 garments to be delivered on 30th of November, the customer expects 50,000 on 30th of November, not on 1st of December, because their own store launch dates are dependent on this. So for which I need to get all my raw material for that particular garment on a certain date so that I can complete the manufacturing well in time to be shipped out, right? So all of these have huge implications on, how do we not just produce in the factory, but also the supply chain.
So you're talking about differences in merchandise mix, you're talking about differences in operations, right?
Right.
But tell me, a kurta is a kurta.
Okay.
It's yellow or red. The production process is the same. It's small or medium. The production process is the same.
Yes, it is the same. But then, a kurta will have, let's say, an embroidery. It can have an embellishment. It can have a certain type of wash. If you look at a jeans, there are different types of washes on a jeans. There will be distressing on the jeans. There may be, pattern. So there is a lot of things which change and the fabric can be different. A silk kurta is different from a linen kurta, is different from a cotton kurta, right? So there are nuances here. And what works since we are in exports. So if I'm shipping a goods to Sweden versus shipping it to Greece, the label will have a difference, which is based on the regulation, the language, etc. So I have to attach the right label to the right garment. There'll be specs associated with that. So there's a ton of things which can change with individual garments, when you're producing it.
Wonderful. Rashmi, how do we stock this in the store? This is the kind of thing that we're talking about in the back end, the merchandise. How do we decide on the merchandise mix on the website? It's an unlimited store.
I mean, adding to the interesting point that you as the consumer make, that a kurta is a kurta, I can empathize with Shiva, where he's trying to explain that the complexity and the art and the science of making that garment is actually a lot, because this is how the consumer reacts, with a 6 months to a 13-month fashion cycle, much before in advance, and the consumer can reject the entire season's collection that you made, and it may not fly off the shelf. And that puts your entire manufacturing cycle into the quandary, because now you're stuck with inventory. The retailer is stuck with inventory, which they're supposed to consume. And then, it does not allow them to open what is called OTB, the open to buy inventory. So the entire cycle does get kind of disrupted there. And that is where what is called the connoisseur's dose of sniffing the trends that are happening at the consumer level comes into play, and buyers play a very, very important role to kind of, decide almost 6 months in advance as to what you will be wearing 6 months later in the season. So that's actually science. That's part art and part science. Doing very rigorous sell-through analysis of what's actually selling. And like we say, and we have a person who is at a global stakeholder, and here is a national brand. So you study it at a geography level, and mind you, like in cars and like in apparel, these are very emotional purchases. These are not generic essentials, the tissue paper, brand, you can probably replace one with the other. But what people choose to buy as a car, their household dresses and apparel are very, very emotional purchases, because they are kind of linked to status, personality profile. And hence the science of buying plays a very, very important role. We study geographies, we study catchment, what sells in Chennai may not sell in Lucknow, what sells in Lucknow may not sell in Agartala. And hence, buyers with acute data analysis study exactly the kind of sizes that are moving, exactly the kind of colors that are moving, exactly the kind of trends that are moving in neck shapes, sleeve sizes, while what is loosely, let's say, called a kurta or a polo t-shirt actually has too much built into it for you to make that trigger purchase, where you were at Forum Mall and picked up one t-shirt versus the other, had a lot of science built behind it for you to pick up that t-shirt. So there is a workforce of buyers and merchandisers that works rigorously to allow you to make that choice. Okay. And that's what differentiates between success of a brand and not, because that's how one brand differentiates from the other. At the end of the day, yes, we're all selling polo t-shirts, blue color fill shirts and kurtas, but that is what differentiates.
Okay, so all of you are telling me that data matters.
Yes.
So take us through your data journey. How has your data evolved over the last, not just the pandemic, but over the last few years? We now have so much more power to analyze data, both between the offline store to the online store, and variety of other social connects that we have. I'm not only looking at Lucknow, but I'm also looking at people on Facebook on Lucknow, people on Twitter on Lucknow. And we're looking at differentiating a Kanpur from a Lucknow or a Erode from a Tirupur. Right? I can make those kinds of micro differences, or
Yes.
25-year-olds from a 30-year-olds.
I
How
think
do
that
we
is
make
what
sense
the
of
dif-
this?
Yeah, I think that is what the difference is. Data was always available. Access to data has improved in the years. We always had a network of 8,000, 10,000 stores and point of purchase across the country. And you relied on what may now sound like a few archaic system of Excel sheets and travel reports and sales reports being submitted by sales managers, to now actually seeing live GA of, who's hovering over what picture on your website, and in real time, can you send them that consumer an offer so that what she has put in her cart can convert to an actual transaction. So I think the power has shifted because data has now become more real, more live, and more actionable. And now it comes in insightful bite-sized pieces so that you can actually, I can personalize an offer for you versus a Shiva versus a Manisha. And that's what data is enabling all of us to do.
Mm-hmm. How has Caro used data?
Well, I was just listening to Shiva. Okay, first thing first, before I talk about data, a kurta may not be a kurta. Let me just correct you. A Toyota Innova is not just an Innova. Yeah, there are 4 variants. There are several colors. There are many
Moderator,
8-seater, 7-seater. So yeah, let's take a step back. Yeah.
you're teasing all of you into answers.
Okay. No, I just feel passionate about cars, so I just had to.
Yeah, sure.
And one car is several kurtas. Okay. Okay. So back to data, right? So we are a tech company, and we've been collecting data since the time we started our operations. We collect data on pricing. First of all, pricing of cars. You see, so maybe an Innova right now, a 7-seater is hot right now. Over time, maybe the new 8-seater comes, and what does that mean for the old 7-seater? Actually, the pricing changes all the time. So we actually have our own proprietary algorithm where we look at the way the demand and supply of certain car make models is moving, not only in the B2B, but also in the B2C segments, because it really varies. The demand really varies. I mean, let's look at India, right? When it comes to Diwali, I know that demand of certain slightly more expensive cars actually goes up. And if you bring that insight to, say, Singapore, Southeast Asia, it is pretty much the same. So apart from the customer data that demands that are happening, you overlay that with the public data, which means like in Singapore, when the government imports certain cars, right, because we don't manufacture any cars here, what does that mean for, again, car pricing? So again, there's more data to be collected there. Now, I've already talked about the data we collect when somebody starts driving, right? Which is a telematics device, how much you drive, and also eventually how well you drive, which means the worse driver you are, the more you pay. But there's also a ton of data because we have our own workshops that we collect on what are people fixing in their cars, given the make and the model. So I'll give you an example. I can tell you very confidently, if you were to buy a Volkswagen Golf by year 4, you will have a gearbox problem. So what does that mean? That means if you're buying a car from us, and we will tell you beforehand, and we would have already worked with the partners to get you a new or maybe a used gearbox, which is still in a good condition. And we give sort of the information back to the customer. So data is actually what Rashmi said. Data has always been there. It's just that now we are able to pool it together. And given how traditional an industry automotive is, any bit of data, trust me, can make the whole proposition really very exciting, from financing to insurance to fixing the car, the after-sales service. It's actually very exciting.
Yeah. Shiva?
So apart from just the consumer data, right, there's a whole lot of data that we need to look at it when you're manufacturing. Naturally, you're looking at trying to manufacture at a ever lower cost so that you can improve your margins, right? And there are two parts to it. One is, of course, your manufacturing efficiency, and the other is your components that you buy. So if I'm buying certain fabric from China, can I get it developed in India so that I can reduce the lead time of that particular fabric coming all the way from China? It's a technical fabric, let's say. If I am able to get my fabric supply chain to be able to produce that fabric to that quality in India, then I cut my lead time by 2 weeks. It also improves the delivery and the predictability of when I get it, and so on and so forth. So there is that a lot of data that we use to understand who could produce what and how can we drive cost efficiencies in the supply chain. Right. The other is it's ton of data that we use in the manufacturing itself. So for example, we manufacture a lot of SKUs, right, in tens of thousands at any point in time. So I've costed a particular garment with all its raw material and manufacturing time. Now, what's the trend analysis for fabric consumption? So the shirt that you're wearing, if it consumes 1.5 meters of fabric, can I produce it in 1.45 meters of fabric by engineering it better? And the 5 centimeters I save is a ton of money that I save produced across hundreds of thousands of shirts that I produce, right? So those kind of, if it takes 20 minutes to produce, if I can produce it in 18 minutes, 10% more productivity that I get. How do I get the 10% more productivity out of that shirt which I'm producing, right? So how do I go about shaving the few seconds in production and thus have a profit element to it? So finally, when I'm costing a particular garment, so let's say that this particular garment I'm pricing at $19. Now, in the $19, there's a certain material cost, there is a certain manufacturing cost, showing blah, blah, blah. Now, when I'm finally produce the garment, did I produce it at $19? Did I produce it at $18.50, $19.10, whatever it is? And on which component did I make money or lose money, right? And hence, that's got an implication on how do I price my future orders and how do I produce the other garments as well. So data has got an element in manufacturing, in supply chain, in consumer demand prediction, so on and so forth. There's ton of data available, and how do you use them, how effectively use them, and how real time you get it, right? So there's no point in having data coming after 2 months. That's outdated. It's useless. I need data which is relevant today for my manufacturing, for my prediction, and so on and so forth, so that I can put it to good use and I can profit from it. So the whole notion of data collection and presenting it works works towards providing that.
So what I hear all of you say is that I collect data from the past, from the usage, from the business, to be able to not just predict, but also to be able to shape further customers. I should be able to also, nudge people into doing certain things and move consumer preferences into something else as well. Not so much in the B2B business that Shiva is into, but at least in the Jaipur business or in the Karo business, where I can actually nudge a customer with specific offers or with specific pushes into the Facebook pages, saying, you look like, it looks like you were browsing here. Would you be also interested in doing this kind of nudges?
Actually, Prof, I just want to add to that. For our trade, it's actually a problem. Like Rashmi said, that if people are searching online more for, say, kurtas or for, say, bed sheets, right, that means there's more demand coming in. For our trade, it's actually the other way around.
Yeah.
More people look at a Ferrari, even though they can't afford it, rather than an Innova. So just because there's 10 times more viewership of Ferrari doesn't mean that people are going to buy it.
You need to look at more than just the buying, the viewership behavior. What are they looking for in a Ferrari?
Well, that's the thing, right? And even when we get inquiries, people have very lofty ideas. They want a Mercedes, but when it comes to dollars and cents, then they go to a Volkswagen, and then slowly they will just settle for a small Honda. So that's what happens. So for our trade, actually, a bit of too much data,
Exactly.
not using the common sense can really drive us crazy.
True, very true.
In our business also, Manisha, enough people look at the Sabyasachi lehenga and then come and buy.
Oh, really?
It's equivalent.
Nice.
I think that will also true for Shiva's business, where the customers will come and ask them for a price which is like nobody else can produce.
No, so that happens all the time, right? So for example, let's say a customer says that the designer does the design of the dress and decides on what should be the pricing. Let's say this particular garment I want to retail at $24, okay? And then they come to us and then we say that, look, we can maintain the aesthetics, we can do these few tweaks, and I should be able to, I will be able to reduce the fabric requirement. I should be able to still maintain the aesthetics and so on and so forth. And you will be able to retail it at $20. Now, is that interesting for you, right? And at $20, what should be your prediction of how many garments you can sell? So at 24, you think this will sell 80,000 pieces, but at 20, I believe I can sell 150,000 pieces. So those kind of dialogues happen with us, and then we actually the garment now is a different one, right? But then at a better price point. So there's a lot of things that you can do with this.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Very nice insights. I have a lot of questions from the audience. Let me go through them. Let me prioritize these questions. We have a question for Siva. How are the production process and apparel manufacturing aiming to become sustainable? There are many global consumers who have a model of fast fashion. How do you see that affecting the manufacturing process? That's the question from the audience. I'm going to add a little more. There's also a whole debate about fast fashion being economically unsustainable because the faster you buy, the more you buy, and therefore more you throw away.
Right. That's right. In fact, that's been a big discussion globally. In fact, it's believed that the apparel industry is the second largest polluter after the oil industry because of all the landfills which are getting clogged with fast fashion garments. Right? People are wearing garments for 3 or 4 uses and then shunning them. There are several garments which never get used. You buy because they're cheap and then just throw away because you never got to take it out at all. And cheaper and cheaper garments are driving this. So sustainability has many connotations to it. Like, are you using water? Are you polluting the air? Are you polluting the water, etc. Right? So there's and sustainability carries through the value chain. So in the fabric production example, if you're using denims, it is polluting. The indigo dyes have an issue. The water consumption is an issue. So how do you make waterless denims, for instance? We do washing a lot, industrial grade washing. I have a ZLD, which is zero liquid discharge. So the entire water is recycled with no water being wasted in the process. That's a sustainable operations. Power, if we can use solar power instead of traditional power from the grid, that makes the product sustainable. So there is a whole lot of manufacturing process tweaks which are going on. Including, can we use organic cotton, recycled polyester? So there's a lot of demand for recycled poly, for instance. So we are working with our suppliers to see if we can convert, the waste plastics, etc., and convert it into fiber and then produce garments out of it. So the supply chain is gearing ourselves to do that. Now, the problem with all these sustainable garments are that they're priced more. And end consumers have a problem that they want a sustainable garment at the same price or lower, right? This is the conundrum which people will have to step up to and break themselves as well, because
the trick is to put a sporting label on the sustainable garment.
That's right.
If you put a Virat Kohli's name on it, it will sell.
well, people have to pay the price. That's
exactly.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Good.
Wonderful. Manisha, I have a question for you. Do you see consumer preferences when it comes to cars shift from buying to lease? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the leasing model?
Well, the number one disadvantage is for us, right? If we have to own the inventory, we don't want that as a tech company. So that is something that we don't like. And like you said, right, car is still a very emotional purchase, and it does, as much as we try to ask people to rent it instead, there is a certain status symbol that also comes together with cars. And now that people are not able to travel overseas, people want to pamper themselves by upgrading either their car or getting their home renovations done a little bit. So I would say there are no disadvantages to either leasing or owning. What really matters is how you want to drive, essentially. Like for me, I can easily lease a car from my company. I'll get a staff discount, but I love the car that I have right now, and I don't want to let go of it. Right. So it's just a personal preference, honestly. Yeah. If I wasn't driving, maybe I would have leased one instead.
So there's a follow-up question on this. How emotional this buying experience is. Do you believe we can absolutely get rid of this entire offline infrastructure, selling infrastructure?
Oh, definitely.
100% online, e-commerce.
Definitely. Oh, yes. It's just a matter of time. So one of the trends we are seeing globally is, how these big car manufacturers have their huge showrooms set up, like big showrooms with lots of cars and very fancy customer experience, they are now moving into smaller malls in the neighborhood. So they're actually opening shops in the neighborhood malls so that customers have can purchase a car within their neighborhood. So that is, to me, that sort of decentralization is already happening. Now with tech companies like ours, all it takes is really digitizing the entire end-to-end experience. And again, give the customer the confidence that even if you make a mistake in buying something, online, you can return it just like you can return a Zara clothes. If they don't fit you, the price tag is still, they just don't dirty the car, don't overdrive it. And I think over time, this is only going to change. In fact, in China, this is happening a lot already. People are buying cars online in the UK as well, and also in the US. It's just a matter of time.
Okay, I have a question for Rashmi. Jaipur has a big dependence on skilled labor that provides the handicraft aspect of the offering at Jaipur. How do you think that the pandemic has affected that supply chain? We did talk about you getting this one, but in terms of the handicraft, it's not an individual person. There's an entire family, even within the
entire family. It's an entire cluster. It's an entire village sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think they are the most vulnerable part of the society. Unfortunately, and that's what has happened in the last decade, while Europe was importing a lot of fashion from India, but the artisan of India did not get the credit and they did not become the celebrated karigars. They're still the invisible karigars. So what we are trying to do with Jaipur is, one, adopt clusters after clusters. I think the largest part that gets affected there is working capital. The artisan, the karigar is dependent on the dinka dihadi. They work with these seva samitis where they go submit their work and they get the labor return at the end of the day. But as a large conglomerate at ABG, what we're trying to do is we're trying to arrange for microfinance. We're trying to arrange to ensure that these people have access to capital, they have access to advance, they have access to cash. Because what we've seen, and this happened in the pre-COVID era also, but the COVID has actually kind of exposed some more vulnerabilities of this sect. So we are trying to adopt an entire craft, trying to ensure, one, that the craft doesn't die, two, that they're well funded for them not to look at alternate careers, and the next generation also kind of stays interested. So that's the part of a large, I don't want to call it CSR, because at the heart of Jaipur, that is our business. We don't do this business because of CSR. Jaipur's business is based on making art and craft accessible to the country. And to add to what, like, for example, Shiva was saying, you don't want, I think the consumer themselves are responsible for it, that in the last decade of consumerism, a t-shirt is, costing less than your cup of coffee. We need to go back to some of our greener practices of buying more sustainable. And when the demand increases, already the prices will come down, because economies of scale work like that. And then you wouldn't think that craft is only for elite. Craft is for everybody. Craft is for me and you and for everybody. And that should be a part of our lifestyle. So at Jaipur, I think the larger purpose is to make craft accessible to everybody. And once you don't want to do charity to the artisan, you want to give them livelihood. And our job is to increase the consumption by making the craft more accessible and price it right, so that the consumer is not favoring in what we're calling loosely synthetic, which is ending in the landfill. And I think the pandemic has done a good job in pushing all of us for that whole vocal for local and looking at more sustainable choices. I think more than ever, all of us are looking at far more sustainable choices. So at a business level, I think it also works for us.
So I'm just thinking aloud. Is the brand now Jaipur, or is the brand Kantaben?
Sorry, say that again.
Is the brand image shifting away from a Jaipur, Aditya Birla to a Kantaben in Kutch?
I think the brands were used to be much more tighter about what their marketing and consumer imagery was. I think it's all more inclusive. In one of our Artisan Direct program, we've actually put Pabi Ben at the face of our website, because we enabled a program called Direct to Artisan. So there isn't, it's more transparent than ever. We're bringing the artisan to your fore. We're making the consumer talk directly to the artisan in some cases. People are asking for customized choices. We look at ourselves as enablers. the brand at the front of it stays Jaipur because that's what the platform is. But I think we are more enablers who are supposed to make the craft meet the consumer and thereby increase the consumption and bring it to your homes.
Okay. So how does brand matter in, say, Shiva's case? Does brand at all undergo a change?
So from a manufacturing perspective, there is a manufacturer brand as well, right? So you stand for something. What do you like? We as a brand stand for our ability to design. So there are certain brands who would expect us to work with them and use our expertise to help come with designs which they can put out in the market. To what we stand for in terms of reliability, in terms of ability to produce high fashion garments at an appropriate cost points, etc. We stand for sustainability, so on and so forth. So that's an B2B brand, but it does stand for something. So that on that basis, people will come to us and buy. It also stands for our ability to produce a wide variety of garments, right? Being able to handle technical textiles, being able to handle complex garments. So we produce industrial garments, for instance. That's a whole different ballgame altogether, where people wearing these garments near a furnace, or extreme cold weather garments which the Indian Army uses. Those are different kinds. But there are all kinds of. So our brand has to stand for many things in different market spaces. But it's an industrial brand. It's not an end consumer brand from our context and perspective. Our brand also means something for suppliers, because we have a number of suppliers globally. Again, they, are we paying them on time? Are we paying? Are we, giving them the right terms when we are buying from them, and so on and so forth. So they will want to do development work for which they have to make certain investments on our behalf to do the development. Will they work for XYZ or will they work for Gokuldas? They will probably work for GE. So that brand commands certain investments from our suppliers too, to do, to further the business.
I think that's what is true for both Jaipur as well as for Caro, is about a brand that stands for being able to procure, in your case, manufacture a variety, to be able to have an inventory of whatever I want. I want the Honda, I need the Honda. I want this particular model, I should have it in demand, in supply. And the same thing with Jaipur, where I want a particular thing, customized garment. I don't want every Kutchi garment to be black and red, but can I have a little more yellow in the Kutch garment, right? Now, at the heart of all of these, at the heart of all of this transformation, with the digital, with the data, engaging with the customers, engaging with the backend and the supply chain, I think it's very important that we hold our brand strengths strong. Right? Does that resonate with all of you? Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Absolutely.
Definitely, yes.
Wonderful. So at this point in time, I think I've run out of meaningful questions. There are questions on data privacy, which I think is not the right panel to ask. I've run out of these questions. One big question that I have in this thing, it's a big motherhood question. Maybe I'll just throw it at you guys. Is the V-shaped recovery in demand a temporary phenomenon, or it'll peter out as the pent-up demand is fulfilled? Is there a V-shaped recovery in the first place, Manisha?
I like to look at it as a W-shaped recovery. So every time it goes up and down, up and down. So eventually the W will become a U and then it'll be fine.
I like sinusoidal waves.
So it's interesting, right? I mean, when I look at it, recovery from our standpoint, I have to look at it from two perspectives. One is, what's the recovery of the economy as a whole, which means demand, right? So it could be V, U, W, whatever shape you want to call it, right? You can even use Kannada alphabets if you wish. But when it comes to a B2B player, there's another nuance to it. So, for example, let's assume that worldwide garment demand has fallen by 30%. All right. That doesn't mean that a garment manufacturer demand falls by 30%. Exactly. Because I'm supplying to I am one amongst many suppliers. And when my customers' demand falls by 30%, they don't cut, secularly everybody's demand by 30%. If you're a strong supplier, you could still retain your share, and the weakest supplier in the link will go away. So from a B2B perspective, you could still maintain your demand while the end consumer demand, end economy demand tanks. So when you talk of recovery, we are talking in such, you said it's a motherhood question. It's absolutely correct. That's the right characterization. But it doesn't mean the same for everyone.
Exactly.
So for us, for example, I'm a global player. The demand in China hasn't fallen as much as the demand in Europe, and your demand in US is somewhere in between. So I can pivot myself to different countries, different brands, and B, within the brands, I can make sure that I am a supplier of choice, and hence my demand, on the contrary, has grown rather than fallen because I have actually taken the share of the other guy.
Exactly.
So there are nuances, and it may mean different things to different people.
And for instance, Aditya Birla has been able to do the SKU mix.
Yes. So I will sell more bed sheets till the time people start buying more silk kurtas.
Exactly.
There you go.
There we go. Thank you very much. It's been an interesting panel. When I looked at the panelists, I thought, how am I going to stitch these three things together? But we really seem to have very common business characteristics and very common responses to the common problem that the world is facing today. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you all here.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Sir.
much.
Great.
Thanks, Prof.
Before we